Hey everyone, my name is William, and I'm here coming to you from the United Kingdom, where I'm about to give my presentation on Chapter 11, Leadership. So, leadership, as we all know, is a very important and vital part of any organization. I mean, we deal with it every day. We deal with leadership in our own home, we deal with leadership when dealing with our children, when dealing with family members, when just dealing with life in general. We're constantly dealing with leadership and management and other sorts of interactions, as you will. To begin with, we're just going to go ahead and start off with just the general meaning of leadership. What does leadership mean? Well, our textbook tells us that leadership is three. It's a process, it's a property, and then it also includes influence. So leadership as a process basically is the non-coercive aspect of leadership. So managers who direct their groups to operate, but are able to do it without threatening pay reductions or administrative threats of some sort, are using a form of leadership. They're using a process of leadership. Leadership as a property. The textbook says leadership as a property is characteristics attributed to those who are perceived to use such influence. So basically, leadership as a property doesn't even have to be someone who is in charge. Leadership as a property can just be an individual who holds influence over a group by their demeanor, by the way they behave. People just tend to follow them. And that brings us to influence. It encompasses both the process and the property of leadership, which I guess it would be the concept of people are born with it or they have it, which we will get into later on as we continue to look at leadership. Moving from the meaning of leadership onto the next slide, we have management versus leadership. So they are two distinct, different things, but yet they're similar. So management, you can be a manager and not be a leader, as much as you can be a leader and not be a manager. Managers don't always make good leaders, just as leaders don't always make good managers, and I know that's redundant because I just said it before. But what it does mean is a lot of times managers are good at handling the finances, handling the administrative stuff, but they may not be very adept at taking people from point A and moving them to point B. It may just simply be that they just don't have the personality, they don't have, I guess you would say, the people skills to get someone to where they need to go. Again, I'm getting way ahead of myself, so mind you, we're still in management versus leadership. Where leaders are also not necessarily managers. Maybe leaders can help managers facilitate their job, but maybe they just don't have the wherewithal to do the financials and do the logistics and handle all the administrative stuff. That's all possible. It's all a real possibility that the two just don't always mix. One does not always make the other. However, with that being said, companies and industries need both managers and leaders in order to really prosper and to move on and to help guide them through the tunnels of industry, if you will. Our textbook's very clear that companies need both managers and leaders. Moving to the next slide, we get into a little bit deeper concept of what leadership is. Our textbook talks about how leadership really has been studied hard over the last 100 years or so. And this takes us to the approaches to leadership. So if you look at the approaches to leadership, it starts out with trait approach and behavioral approach. The initial studies that came about of looking into what makes leaders and what doesn't make leaders was the trait approach. And the trait approach was basically summarized by saying people have certain characteristics or there's certain things that just make people leaders. So they talk about intelligence, dominance, self-confidence, energy, activity, and task-relevant knowledge. And they go in our textbook, they talk about how they perceived Abraham Lincoln to be a great leader because he was tall for some strange reason. However, the problem that came into play with the trait approach was people were quick to point out, well, yes, Abraham Lincoln was a great leader, and yes, he was tall, but Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler were viewed as leaders or good leaders in their own weird, psychotic way, but they're short. So it negates your concept that, well, because you're tall, you're a good leader, or because you're broad-shouldered, you're a good leader. So the trait approach ran into some hiccups, not to mention the fact that their list was a mile long, which then brought us to the behavioral approach. Now, oddly enough, being originally from Ohio, I found it interesting that Michigan began a study on behavioral traits for leadership, and they came up with the employee-centered and the job-centered behavior. And yet at the same time, this is why I find it funny, Ohio State began doing a study on the same issue. So you can't have one without the other, apparently, even in academia. So Michigan came up with, they found two behavioral traits, one of them the employee-centered and the other one the job-centered. The title pretty much explains it all. The employee-centered is the supervisor or the leader is looking to the traits of the individual and seeing what their needs are. Where the job-centered is we just really care about getting the job done. The Ohio State study found two traits as well, and they were fairly similar. They had the consideration behavior and the initiating structure behavior. The consideration behavior was considering and concerned with the employees, where the initiating structure behavior was basically saying, I'm in charge, this is how the structure is. If you don't like it, move on. Now, the reason I believe that they found this was because the Ohio State study sent out their surveys to both civilians and military. And at the time of the study, the military side would have been very much more structured. This is, I'm in charge, this is what we're doing, A, B, C, D. So it is interesting, though, that they both performed the study, found similar traits, worded them differently, as you would expect two opposing universities to do. This leads us into situational leadership. Basically, to surmise situational leadership is, there is no one right way to solve an issue within an organization, and there is no rote way for a leader to solve a problem. So you have to, I provided the scale or the situational leadership diagram in the slide, as you can see, if you've moved on, which you should have moved on from approaches to leadership to situational leadership, I apologize. And you can see that the situational leadership is definitely, Tannenbaum and Schmidt, were the ones who developed this, and they looked at it from across the spectrum. And basically the spectrum is like, okay, this is the personality, this is everything else, and you have to take everything into consideration and merge it all together. Moving on to the next slide, we have the LPC theory, or the least preferred coworker. The least preferred coworker sounds very negative, and I do understand that. However, when you look at the least preferred coworker, when you fill out the least preferred coworker form, it actually reveals more about the manager than it does about the least preferred coworker. Now, least preferred coworker, by definition in the textbook, says leadership effectiveness can depend on the situation and give reason to why the leader would be ineffective in that situation. Hence, the LPC, looking at the least preferred coworker, reveals more about the leader than it does the least preferred coworker. Task versus relationship motivation was another thing. Task motivation resembles the results of the job-centered and initiating structure, and relationship motivation resembles the employee-centered and consideration that was found in the Ohio State and Michigan studies. So the LPC theory found and corroborated some of the other studies that have been done. Moving on to the next slide, you have something called the path goal theory. The path goal theory is basically leaders that say, okay, if you want to make more money, you want a bonus, this is the direction you go. And a lot of the path goal theory is dependent upon the leader's behavior and the situational factors. Basically, how the leader views the characteristic of the subordinate and the environment is the situational factor. So it takes a lot of personality into account. Moving on to Vroom's decision tree. So you had two of Vroom's decision tree. One of them was the time decision, and the other one was the developmental decision. They're unique to the situation, as in, if you need to figure out what process to take to solve the problem as a leader, if time is the most key element, then you would follow the time decision tree. If you wanted to take time to develop an employee as a mentoring, then you would use the development-driven decision tree for Vroom. I've provided two examples of the time decision tree and the developmental decision tree as well for you to view. Ultimately, throughout reading the entire chapter, it basically comes down to there is no real discernible reason why someone is viewed as a leader and why someone is not viewed as a leader. What it does come down to is, how do we perceive our own leadership, be it our own personal leadership or be it the people that we work around. You can do study after study, but everybody is going to handle things differently. Which is why, on the final slide, I provide the question, how has a leader affected you in a positive way? And conversely, how has a manager who thought he was a leader affected you in a negative way? And how would you have dealt with the problem differently? Thanks for your time. I look forward to reading your responses. Have a great day.